Thank you. So welcome to Vermont House Transportation Committee. It's Wednesday afternoon, 8th of February. We're just getting started as we are going to hear from the sponsor of the bill, H101, for a few minutes, and from our legislative counsel to walk the committee through the bill. And if we could, H101 involves transportation planning, climate, greenhouse gas, and a host of other transportation issues. So we'll be hearing from them this afternoon.
Okay, for the record, Representative Molly Burke presenting H101. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity. I can do this pretty fast because we have our wonderful legislative counsel to go through it in detail. I just want to say this is a proposal of things that are, sort of in line with what we're all trying to do. Is we just heard about the carbon reduction plan this morning, and it's very exciting. And I think a lot of these things align with it, and maybe they're already being done in the carbon reduction plan. So these are the things that we'll find out. So these are just my proposals, and also Representative Stebbins is a co-sponsor of this bill. And it comes from my desire to really work on the issue of how do we cut our carbon emissions from transportation, which has been a very difficult thing, as we know, and it still continues to be a challenge. So basically, just a number of things that the bill does, sort of a collection of proposals. It requires the agency to present a written plan with recommendations on how to fund state efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and increase access to higher efficiency, lower cost transportation emissions. Sounds very familiar to what we heard this morning. Create the legislative regional transportation climate initiative working group to study regional climate initiatives, such as the Transportation Climate Initiative Program, another topic of this morning's conversation. It implements a self-funded fee-based program based on pleasure car efficiency. Basically, it just sets up a task force to look at that. We've had a fee-based study in the past. It didn't give any recommendations, and this would offer some recommendations. And would require the Agency of Transportation to assess motor vehicle fuel use in Vermont in order to identify the most effective actions to transition operators to plug-in electric vehicles. So how do we know that what we're doing are the efficient, and I think there were questions about this today, are the things that we're incentivizing, are they going to the right people? So this would sort of help us to identify that. Appropriate money for the Mobility and Transportation Innovation Grant Program, the Bicycle and Pedestrian Program, and the e-bike incentive program, all things that we've funded in the past. Require the Agency of Transportation to provide a written recommendation on a dedicated funding source that will match required of public transit providers in Vermont. This was, Jamie Feehan asked me to sort of include this in the bill as sort of a placeholder for a discussion about funding of local match of public transit. So that's where that comes from. Make modifications to the incentive program for new PEVs and replace your ride program and the annual reporting requirements for the state's motor vehicle incentive programs. So do we need to change the incentive levels or the income levels or things like that in order to really get at the people who need the incentive? Amend the state's transportation planning policy related to greenhouse gas emissions and infrastructure resilience. Update the state's complete streets policy and require the Agency of Transportation to provide municipalities with training on complete streets. I've been meeting with Kelly Stoddard-Poor of AARP, and this is language that AARP has proposed to sort of update the complete streets provisions, which is a bill that I worked on in 2011, I think it was. Require the Agency of Transportation to update the Vermont state standards. That may be happening anyway. Require the Agency of Transportation to work with Amtrak and other entities on certain modifications of Amtrak service in Vermont. That came from suggestions from former Representative McCormick, as you might imagine. And the final topic is to appropriate money to maintain zero fare service on all urban public transit routes. So that's going to be a conversation here. We know there are some other suggestions rolling around about how to provide like transit passes to low-income people if we were to reinstitute fares. So again, as I said, these are just some proposals for discussion to be possibly some incorporated in different ways in the transportation bill.
Great.
Questions?
We could ask Representative Brooks questions. We're also about to get, it's a really nice, just kind of overview.
Yeah.
Maybe we should just move into getting the walkthrough if that's.
I think that's a very good idea. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for bringing this to our committee. So Anthea Dexter. Back.
Thank you. So for the record, Anthea Dexter Cooper from the Office of Legislative Counsel. I'm going to be putting up on the screen H101. Jeannie has posted it on the committee page under my name today, which makes it easy to find. You also can always search in that top bar for H101. So I'm going to try and get this done in the time that you've allotted for it. But as you just heard from Representative Burke, there's a lot in this bill. If you just base it on the number of topics in the statement of purpose, this is kind of like 12 bills all combined in together. So you're basically getting 12 walkthroughs back to back to back. So the first thing in section 1 is that this act has a short title. It's not required for legislation to have a short title. This is something that has been incorporated in the bills that I would say that are the prior iterations of something like this. There was the Transportation Innovation Act and the Transportation Modernization Act. So this is the third year that some of the members of your body have worked together to propose sort of an omnibus bill that would be an approach to ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector. Like those past bills, this includes some legislative findings. Most of them come from the Transportation Innovation Act and the Transportation Modernization Act. There are some that are new, so I was going to focus on those a bit more. As we go through this, I will mention if a section has an effective date that is not on passage. These first two sections are effective on passage. When we get to things where the effective date matters a bit more, like there's an appropriation, I'll mention what the effective date is there. So I think you might benefit from reading the legislative findings to yourself offline. But I'd like to start focusing on the ones that start down at subsection H, and this is at the bottom of page 5, starting on line 17. These are legislative findings that have not previously been included in these sorts of bills, and they address how much money has been spent on some of these initiatives. So through state fiscal year 2023, Vermont has appropriated more than $205 million in one-time federal funding from ARPA and more than $63,700,000 in one-time general fund monies for climate action initiatives. Those are not limited to the transportation sector, that's writ large. From federal fiscal year 2022 through federal fiscal year 2026, and this is now expectation of, Vermont expects to receive approximately $1.7 billion in formula funding for transportation from the IIJA. This anticipated formula funding includes approximately $21 million for plug-in electric vehicle charging infrastructure, approximately $32.8 million for carbon reduction programs, and approximately $37.3 million for climate resilience. In addition to these formula funds, Vermont's also going to be eligible for competitive federal grant opportunities for specific activities that would be related. In J, this is focusing on what is Vermont going to need to do with all of this money. The state will need to strategically fund efforts to transition Vermont's transportation sector and for transportation initiatives that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions once the available federal monies are depleted, including the possibility that the federal formula funds that are available under the IIJA are going to go sort of back more to what they were in their FAST Act iteration. Was this a one-time increase, or are you looking at what the new floor is? Obviously, this is something you're going to need to think about when you think about the revenue piece for the non-federal match. And that leads into subsection K. As Vermont's transportation fund revenues begin to drop due to the antiquated gas tax and evolution of higher efficiency vehicles, Vermont's going to need to explore new revenue streams to finance the transportation needs for these different purposes. One of the things that a committee can get really caught up in is debating all of the details of the legislative findings. They are not, just like the short title, required. Sometimes I see them being included in a bill that's introduced and then stripped out as the bill moves forward. But I think they sort of frame the the foundation for some of the why as to the sponsors' motivation behind introducing H101. While we are talking about the money piece for future fiscal years, what Section 3 of H101 does is it requires a report back with a plan. This would come in on or before January 15th of 2024. It would go to the two transportation committees along with the money committee. So that's going to be appropriations on both bodies, Ways and Means and Finance, with a recommendation or recommendations on how to fund state efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and increase access to higher efficiency, lower cost transportation options at a pace that will be necessary to achieve the reduction requirements in the Global Warming Solutions Act. That's when you see the cite to 10 VSA, Section 578. The written plan also needs to cover how best to utilize federal funding that's been made available to Vermont through the IIJA and what the state has as terms of a new federal funding sources after the non-recurring federal funding made available through ARPA and the IIJA are depleted. So looking forward and then looking way forward. So how are we going to do this in the near future? And then how are we going to do this contemplating the fact that there might be this reduction in available funding? And the written plan needs to expand upon work that has already been done and will continue to be done by the agency and its consultants to secure federal funding through the carbon reduction program and develop the state's carbon reduction strategy. So very much related to the testimony you heard this morning. We'll pause there since that's our first substantive section after the findings in the short title.
So, questions just about this? Like, we're getting a walkthrough of the bill. So, like this, you say that, and like, so if there are just questions about what's on the page, that's what the kinds of questions that I'm trying to, so that we want to try to get through as much of this, but without rushing at it. But because this is the first time that we're taking a peek at it.
And I'm happy to go into more detail at a future date if you realize this is a section that we really think might actually get plucked out of this bill and put in other legislation that you're moving.
Any questions? I think we're good to keep going.
Okay, so Section 4, unlike language that has been introduced in the past, is not directing the state to join or participate in a regional transportation climate initiative, such as the Transportation Climate Initiative Program. You'll see that abbreviated TCIP. Instead, this is creating a legislative committee on a regional transportation climate initiative, creating that group, giving them tasks, and requiring a report back. So there's a finding here, just applicable to Section 4, and it's about the fact that the General Assembly finds that efforts are underway amongst legislators in several New England states to revive a regional transportation climate initiative that would cut greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector, while also providing funding for transforming the transportation system. So there are efforts to join something that will generate revenue, and that's happening across New England. Subsection B creates the Legislative Regional Transportation Climate Initiative Working Group and tasks them with studying regional transportation climate initiatives such as TCIP. It's not exclusive to TCIP, but TCIP is an example of what a regional climate initiative is. And then the group also needs to make recommendations on legislative action related to Vermont's participation in some sort of regional transportation climate initiative. The membership, this is going to be much smaller than the membership of some of the other working groups or committees that you see formulated in legislation, including later on in this one, this membership is limited to 2 current members of the House appointed by the Speaker and 1 current member of the Senate, and that's it. This is entirely made up of current legislators. It's only 3 of them, 2 from the House, 2 from the Senate. Subsection D goes into the powers and the duties of the working group and the things that they need to go through as part of the studying process. The group needs to review the December 2020 Memorandum of Understanding for TCIP. That's what states would have been signing to participate in it. They need to receive 2 updates, one not later than June 15th of 2023 and one not later than November 1 of 2023 on the state's development of its carbon reduction strategies as part of the carbon development to get funding under the carbon reduction program. Members need to attend regional meetings on regional transportation climate initiatives. The group needs to solicit public testimony through public hearings and written comments. The group needs to consult with legislators and organizations in New England about regional transportation climate initiatives. In doing this work, they get the assistance of the Office of Legislative Operations. They would be handling some of the scheduling piece, the Office of Legislative Counsel and the Joint Fiscal Office. You'll see a lot of times with reports, including later on in this, that sometimes an agency or department is tasked with providing support for a committee. Since this doesn't have any members outside of the legislature, this is focused on continuing to have the group have the resources that are available to it as being members of the body. Subsection F gives the details of what needs to be in the report. The report would be coming back on or before December 15th of 2023. It goes to House committees on environment and energy and on transportation, and then the Senate committees on natural resources and energy and on transportation. 2 committees that are left out of this that might end up having a position from a policy perspective and from a finances of the state perspective would be House Ways and Means and Senate Finance, because if you think about sort of the 2 balancing goals of a regional transportation climate initiative, part of it is revenue generating to then use for the funding of alternative transportation initiatives. So it could be that even if the report is not directed to go back to those committees, that those committees would have an interest in the state moving forward and participating in some sort of transportation climate initiative. And then, and if you're going along in paper, I'm now at the top of page 10, goes through everything that needs to be included in the report. So the report needs to have a brief summary of what the working group learned through all of the things that it was required to participate in. It needs to include a recommendation on whether or not the working group itself should continue to exist. It needs to include a determination on any areas of participation in a regional transportation climate initiative that need clarification. And that would include whether or not there needs to be any legislative action on the part of Vermont to enter into an agreement to participate in a regional transportation climate initiative. It needs to include a recommendation on the percentage of any money that's received from participating in a transportation climate initiative that should go to disadvantaged communities. Disadvantaged communities is not defined in this, but that could be something that's addressed in whatever the report that's generated is. Needs to make a recommendation on a definition of disadvantaged communities. I skipped ahead, so they are going to require a definition there. A recommendation on what entity would review and approve the distribution of monies that came in through participation. And then it would need a discrete recommendation on legislation to be enacted in 2024 if that ends up being applicable. For purposes of meetings, that's covered in subsection G. The senator who's appointed to the Committee on Committees, because there'll just be one senator, needs to call the first meeting of the working group to occur on or before August 1st of 2023. The working group would then select a chair amongst those 3 members. A majority of the membership of the working group would constitute a quorum, so 2 out of the 3. The working group needs to identify regional meetings that it would attend, and it needs to ensure that at least 2 of the members attend up to 6 regional meetings during the existence of the working group. Subdivision 5 is to address the fact that Vermont has an open meeting law. It would be a body that might be subject to the open meeting law. And then just to be clear, just because 2 of the members of this working group, a majority, a quorum, go to a regional meeting, wouldn't then make that meeting be subject to the state's open meeting law. And then the working group ceases to exist on July 1 of 2024. If you think about the timing, a lot of times a group or a committee ceases to exist right after its report is submitted to the General Assembly. In this instance, because one of the things that the working group needs to make a recommendation on is whether or not the working group should continue to exist, it made sense to have a little bit of a buffer there so that they would continue to exist through the session to give the General Assembly the ability to maybe say, okay, you worked on this, now go work on this other thing without there needing to be a new formulation of the working group. And then subsection H is pretty standard. It talks about compensation and reimbursement. And it says that the members who are all legislators, they would be entitled to the per diem that you're ordinarily required to as legislators when you participate in something not during session. And that per diem would be available for not more, and reimbursement would be available for not more than 6 regional meetings, for not more than 3 public hearings, and then for not more than 3 additional meetings. So a total of 12 things there. And the payments would be made from money that is appropriated to the General Assembly. And I'll pause there, end of a section.
Don't see any questions.
Okay. We're now dealing with a few sections that are going to be addressing efficiency fees and rebates. This is sometimes combined together under the one word fee-bate. There was a report that was filed with the General Assembly in, it was either early 2020 or late 2019, just before you all left the building for COVID. And it included a lot of really useful information about fee-bates, but as Representative Burke mentioned in her commentary, it did not include a recommendation on how a fee-bate could be implemented in the state of Vermont. The way that a fee-bate works in its simplest form is something that is less efficient would be charged an additional fee, and something that is more efficient would be entitled to a rebate. And you could have a very simple fee-bate where I'm just going to pick a miles per gallon and say that if a vehicle got more than 25 miles per the gallon, it would be entitled to a rebate of a flat amount. And if it was less efficient than 25 miles per gallon, it would be subject to a fee of a flat amount. It is thought, if you look at some of the information about fee-bates, including in that report, that won't necessarily drive behavior in a way that is desired, because there are different classes of vehicles and maybe there need to be steps or buckets or some sort of continuum along the line of, if something is just slightly less efficient, should it be paying the same fee as something that's way less efficient? And same on the flip side, if it's way more efficient, should it only be entitled to the same amount of a rebate of something that's just slightly more efficient? So a fee-bate, I feel, is very simple in its inception. Oh, it's just a fee and a rebate. But when you come to figuring out how you would actually have it apply in a way that would be revenue neutral and drive consumer behavior and potentially manufacturer behavior, it gets a lot more complicated. So I think probably what makes sense for purposes of your work on this bill is for me not to go into the details that's here and do sort of a big picture as I go through the next few sections. That's okay.
That sounds great.
Okay. So section 5 would be putting into codified law effective July 1, 2024, the framework for fee-bates. It has definitions. A lot of them are for vehicle types and they come from EPA definitions. It would be expressing in subsection B that all covered vehicles at the time of initial registration, so they're new, the first time they're registered, would be subject to either an efficiency fee or entitled to an efficiency rebate. And then it has the framework for what those fees and rebates need to do. A lot of it is what we just talked about, but I'm going to highlight in subdivision 3 on page 14, that it would need to be designed to be revenue neutral, which is going to create a complication from year to year as vehicle efficiencies change. So it might yield a revenue neutral rebate system in fiscal year 2025. If vehicles get more efficient, it's not necessarily going to be revenue neutral in fiscal year 2030. So that leads into subdivision 4. Under the inception that would be going into codified law here, it would need to be recalculated on an annual basis in order to achieve that revenue neutrality. And then it requires that there could be a differentiation between a purchased and a leased vehicle if you think about the longevity of the fiscal effect there. And then finally in subsection C, the efficiencies and fee bates for an applicable fiscal year would need to be prominently displayed on the DMV's website and at all dealership locations so that people know what they're getting themselves into. If you think about one of the concerns that the committee had when you were talking about the different vehicle incentives is, well, consumers need to know what the incentive amount is going to be if it's going to motivate behavior and, not be a surprise when it eventually comes time to pay for the vehicle. Same premise here with the fee bates. You should know if you're going to be subject to a fee. You should know if you're going to be entitled to a rebate. And that's the extent of what is put into codified law anticipated for July 1 of 2024. You'll notice that there's nothing there about what the buckets are, about what the different fee and rebate amounts are. Where you will see that language in the bill that you have before you right now, I'm just going to skip ahead and I'm going to go back to section 6, is in section 7, you will see what would become the law also on July 1, 2024, and this is on page 18. What would become the law on July 1, 2024 if the General Assembly doesn't act on a report that it would be getting under section 6. So this is kind of to light a fire under everyone, saying if you don't actually come up with what the fees and rebates should be for fiscal year starting July 1 of 2024, then this is what they're going to be. And this is probably at this point based on some outdated data. As a hopeful alternative to section 7 becoming the law, section 6 requires the formation of an efficiency fees and rebates task force. And their job, among other things, is to come up with what these first fees and rebates should be, and then a way to figure out what the future fees and rebates should be. It's created. It's supposed to figure out a formula for calculating the initial and recalculating the subsequent efficiency fees and rebates that would be collected and distributed under that prior section. It has, under subsection B, 11 members in it. I won't go through who all of them are, but it spans different types of experience and different representation within the administration. They're either individuals or their designees or their appointments by the speaker or by the committee on committees. The task force's duties are in subsection C. They need to make recommendations that are consistent with the climate action plan about what those first fiscal year 2025 efficiency fees and rebates should be. That's in subdivision A. Subdivision B, a way for calculating efficiency fees and rebates for those subsequent fiscal years after fiscal year 2025. It needs to make recommendations on any modifications to the statutory language that was added by the prior section. It needs to make recommendations on any best practices, policies, guidelines for how this could be successfully implemented. It then needs to prepare a report which contains its recommendations. For purposes of preparing that report and making those recommendations, the task force has the drafting assistance from the Office of Legislative Counsel, and any other assistance would be provided by the Agency of Transportation. The report would be coming back to the General Assembly on or before January 15th of 2024, only going back to the transportation committees. Subsection F goes to the meetings. The first one is to incur on or before July 1 of 2023. If you think about the time between adjournment and July 1 of 2023, that might be too short of a time to get all 11 members appointed. But the flip side is that the report back is pretty quick because it's January 15th of 2024. So you kind of need the group in place sooner rather than later. The Secretary of Transportation or designee would be the chair. A majority of the membership constitutes quorum. It ceases to exist shortly into your next legislative session, February 15th of 2024. Subsection D will look very similar. It's about compensation and reimbursement. And there is a cap of not more than 8 meetings. And all of the payments comes from money appropriated to the General Assembly for the legislative members and money that's appropriated to the Agency of Transportation for the non-members of the legislature. Section 7, that's what we talked about earlier, where these are the fees and rebates that go into effect on July 1, 2024, if alternative fees and rebates are not enacted. I'm going to skip over all of those. Those are numbers that probably would change. And then Section 8, which would be effective on July 1 of 2023, appropriates $20,000 to be used in the final quarter of fiscal year 2024 to kind of explain the fact that this fee-based system is coming, because this would be effective on July 1 of 2024. So that last portion of the year, those 3 months prior to July 1, 2024, money would be available for the agency in partnership with Drive Electric Vermont to do outreach and marketing. And then because this would be creating something wholly new in the way that vehicles are either charged a registration fee or incentivized, there needs to be a report there. If there's a desire to have a report there, the Agency of Transportation would need to annually evaluate the implementation of the fee-based system. That report would come back not later than January 15th of each year, and it would be required every year starting in 2026 and continuing to 2031. So 5 years worth of reporting. Then you've got the minimums of what the report needs to include. It's going to be what was required or what was set at the rates for the fees and rebates for the prior fiscal year, the total amount that was collected in fees, and the total amount that was distributed in rebates. Hopefully for it to be revenue neutral, those numbers need to balance out. It needs to include an estimation for the costs of administering the fee-based system. Just because it's revenue neutral doesn't mean that it is free to collect and distribute your fees and rebates, and any recommendations on changes to the system of the efficiency fees and rebates. And that closes out your sections on fee-bates. I'll pause.
So, questions? I know that there's a report from 2019, right?
Yeah, late 2019, I think.
Have any other states done fee-bates?
I am not aware, and I haven't looked into this in a year or two, of any states that had done a fee-bate. Vermont had proposed one, a very, very simple one, I think as far back as 2005, and that legislation never moved forward. It was a bill that had been introduced and been taken up in committee. I think they have been proposed but not fully implemented in some other countries, and a lot of information about that is in the fee-bate report. Despite the fact that it doesn't tell you what to do, it doesn't make any recommendations, there's a lot of really useful stuff in the fee-bate report.
That was from 2019, is that right?
That report in here.
I can get it to you. I'll send it to Jeannie.
Yeah, it's on this committee's page.
It is.
From 2019 under, was it Acosta?
I think that was when Dan Dutcher was still here, so it might be under his name or Joe.
We don't need to do it right now, but if committee members would like that, we can post that on our webpage. Helpful. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Your next topic, this is section 10, starts at the top of page 21. Another report, and this one is looking at how establishing a baseline for the demographics of people in Vermont that are consuming gasoline with a focus on what's defined here as a high consumption fuel user, which is for purposes of this report and what's being looked at here, someone who purchases more than 1,000 gallons of motor vehicle fuel per year. So for purposes of this report, the Agency of Transportation needs to consult with Drive Electric Vermont to assess motor vehicle fuel use in Vermont, to try and identify effective actions that the state can make to transition more operators to plug-in electric vehicles. And to do that, the agency, as part of this report, needs to establish a baseline demographic and geographic profile of who in Vermont is using the most gasoline and diesel, focusing on those individuals who are high consumption fuel users, so that more than 1,000 gallons per year amount. That baseline demographic and geographic profile could then be used to inform decisions on state programs designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So your vehicle incentive programs are the right consumers being incentivized to yield the largest reduction in fuel consumption. The baseline would also then be used to make recommendations on whether the state should modify any of the existing incentive programs, any of the approaches for the electric vehicle supply equipment grant programs, and other efforts to transition to vehicles with lower greenhouse gas emissions. The agency needs to file the written report on that assessment with the House and Senate Committees on Transportation not later than December 1 of 2023. So you would have it with time to spare before your next legislative session.
Question, Representative Walker.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Anthea, saying that on line 9, 10, 11, the agency will establish a baseline demographic and geographic profile that of the Vermont operators. And then you use the word, but I thought you said something about focusing on those individuals. Usually when you're talking demographic and geographic profile, you're talking about like a whole bunch of people or a particular, but you said individuals. So I just want to make sure I understand what this means.
Yeah, so as I understand the concept, and if that is not clear and you want to move forward with this language, then we need to tweak the language, that it's saying focus in the entire state, look at the demographics, but try to have the report have a particular focus on high consumption fuel users. And the reason why I used individuals there is because the definition of a high consumption fuel user is someone singular who is using more than 1,000 gallons per year. I do not know, nor do I know if the agency knows how that can be determined. Would it be looked at by individual registrations? Would you try and see where in the state are there individual inspections that have sufficient miles traveled from year to year to be indicative of someone who is potentially using 1,000 gallons of gas in a year? I don't know how they're going to figure it out, and I don't know if they know how they're going to figure it out.
Oh, but it is saying individuals and not like a company or a particular segment or industry or a type of job or something of that nature. You're talking actual user that puts the nozzle into the actual tank.
But some of
the language is saying the particular individual user.
Yeah, but some of the greatest consumption fuel users in the state could be doing so as part of their job and what they do for a living. So I think there would be a linkage back to potentially high using industries.
For sure. I appreciate the clarification. We are talking about an individual Vermonter.
Yes.
Not an industry or a demographic profile
So
of a
focus on definition of, which is based on individual, but overall demographic of the whole state. So it's going to need to cover the whole state, which could, in the agency's interpretation of the language and what they put into the report and the assessment, be more larger looking than just the individuals, but it needs to focus on them. And it could be that there's difficulties in how the state could do that in 6 months.
Okay. Thank you very much.
I would be very interested to hear the agency's testimony on this, just out of my own personal
I just want to
curiosity.
make sure I understood what it says, that's all.
Did I see Representative Burke?
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Okay.
We're good?
Section 11, we're now getting into a few appropriations. This is the one that I mentioned has a typo in it. So this would take effect on July 1 of 2023, and it would be a fiscal year 2024 appropriation, despite the fact on page 22, line 18, it says fiscal year 2023. So I want to make sure everyone is aware that this is future appropriation, not one of these like going back in time budget adjustment acts. We're changing something for the fiscal year that you're in.
So this is fiscal year 2024.
Yes. So this is an existing program. It's sometimes abbreviated MTI grant program. It was created in 2020. There's the act reference there. It has gotten at least one more iteration of funding. This would be appropriating $10 million for the MTI grant program. Its purpose is to support innovative strategies and projects that improve both mobility and access to services for transit-dependent Vermonters, reduce the use of single occupancy vehicles, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. For purposes of the individual grant awards, the grant awards are capped at $250,000 per recipient that can be used for matching funds for other grant awards, program delivery costs, or for the extension of existing programs. And then there can be not more than 4 recipients that receive not more than $2 million that can be used to operate microtransit programs like the one that's in Montpelier. And there needs to be, in terms of those grant awards, equal consideration given to existing and proposed microtransit programs. If you do the math there and all 4 of the microtransit, all 4 of the grants that can go to microtransit go out and they're all at $2 million, that only leaves $2 million for the other grants, the ones that can be up to $250,000 that are for non-microtransit purposes. And then sort of from a historical perspective, not all of the grants that have gone out under the MTI grant program have been for microtransit. I know at one point there was a website on the agency's page that gave you information about grant recipients from the past that was pretty interesting.
Questions about any of that? Okay.
Section 12, very short section. This is $10 million, requiring that in fiscal year 2024, not less than $10 million goes out through the existing bicycle and pedestrian program for federal aid and small scale grant awards. That would take effect on July 1 of 2023. It's linked to a fiscal year. And this language is sort of intentionally vague because some of the money that can go out for this grant program is federal, not all of it is state dollars. So if this language is included in the transportation bill, the language would need to be tweaked. It wouldn't be able to be just like taken out these 3 lines and stuck in the T-bill. There would need to be a little bit more elaboration there. But the intent of it is to say, and I can't say intent all the time, I can say intent here. The intent is that at least $10 million will go out in these grant awards. Okay, section 13. This is the language that Representative Burke said had been included as a recommendation from Jamie Feehan as sort of a placeholder, but it would require the Agency of Transportation to consult with the Vermont Public Transportation Association and the Vermont League of Cities and Towns to provide the House and Senate Committees on Transportation with a written recommendation on how to come up with some sort of dedicated funding source for the local match that's required of certain public transit providers. And that would need to come back not later than December 1 of 2023. We're now getting into our vehicle incentive program sections within the bill. The first one, section 14, this is at the bottom of page 23, is for e-bikes, and this would be appropriating in fiscal year 2024, effective on July 1 of 2023, $500,000 for e-bike incentives under the existing programmatic guidelines that were established to implement the prior e-bike incentive programs. So unlike what you proposed for the Budget Adjustment Act, which is $100,000 to get you through fiscal year 2023, this is start of fiscal year 2024, $500,000 for e-bike incentives.
Tim Dodge?
This is just a minor question about that, that adjustment that we had about wording about the e-cargo bikes. Can you talk a little bit about whether that would be separate or?
It's in a separate, you're talking about a separate bill that just came out? Yeah, that might be something that we'd have to talk about, that would go here or maybe in one of the.
Sorry? Whether it would go here or?
But yeah, I mean, this would have to be discussed,
Right.
whether the committee wanted to
Take up that bill.
take that up in the context of the motor vehicle bill, or take it up in the context
Or take it up, oh,
up to the committee.
And Representative Dodge, this also doesn't, like the language you saw in the agency's proposal for the transportation bill, where there was proposed to be added to the codified language around those programs, a definition added for e-cargo bicycles. In the agency's proposal, the incentives that would exist that could cover an e-cargo bicycle were going to be the Replace Your Ride and the new program Electrify Your Fleet. The agency's proposal did not include either additional appropriations for the programs for fiscal year 2024 because the programs that were included there for codification all have money remaining in them, unlike the e-bike incentive program, which is currently defunct for the appropriation having been used up. So the e-bike incentive program wasn't proposed for inclusion there. If the committee decided, let's leave well enough alone with the vehicle incentive programs that are not codified and sort of scattered all over the place with session law, a decision point could still be, we still want to put $500,000 to e-bikes, and we also want to have e-cargo bikes be eligible under the e-bike incentive program. This language just on its own would not expand eligibility of the e-bike incentive program to e-cargo bikes.
that's what you want, yeah.
Okay, sections 15 and 16 are related, and they deal with a proposed change to the incentives that are available under the incentive program for new PEVs and incentives that are available under the Replace Your Ride program. And the change is not a change that is proposed in the Agency of Transportation's proposal. So this is separate from that. And that's to have the incentive amount, and this is going to be on page 26, the incentive amount be reduced by the amount that the sales or lease price exceeds the sticker price of the vehicle. So if the sticker price is $45,000, but the vehicle is then sold for $47,000, the incentive amount would be reduced by $2,000. And that would be both for the plug-in incentive, the PEV incentive program, and for Replace Your Ride. And remember, the eligibility for the vehicle is based on the base MSRP, not the sticker price, and not what the vehicle is actually sold for. So you could have a vehicle that is $35,000, falls well below the base MSRP, the sticker price is even higher than that, and then the sales price is still higher than that.
Right, I think we had a question, Representative Campbell.
Anticipated my question.
Did that answer it?
Yes, well, it just, most vehicles are sold for more than the base MSRP because they have packages, convenience package, driver confidence package, whatever they call it. Right, so this would be a problem. Okay, thanks.
And then the language that you see struck out on lines 12 to 16, that is deleting obsolete language. These were those transportation alternative companies that were eligible for incentives in fiscal year 2022. So it's simply being struck out, has already happened. The incentives have already been distributed if they were available to be distributed. The other small change, and this is just for purposes of the incentive program for PEVs, because the Replace Your Ride program doesn't have the same base MSRP cap associated with it. This would be increasing the base MSRP for the battery electric vehicles from $45,000 to $50,000. If you'll remember from the Agency of Transportation's proposal, they propose increasing the base MSRP for both the plug-in hybrids and the battery electric vehicles to that $50,000 amount, and then having the flexibility to adjust it so long as it's approximately $50,000 in model year 2023. And then the Replace Your Ride language is just what we talked about, top of page 28, lines 4 to 9, saying that if the incentive is above, if the sales price is above the sticker price, the incentive amount is reduced accordingly. And those changes would both take effect on July 1 of 2023. If you think about it, it makes sense for people to know what the incentive amount might be adjusted by and what the base MSRP eligibility would be at a set point. It would be hard to implement that if it was on passage.
Representative McCoy and Representative.
So we've stated in other sections here a specific amount, but we haven't for these incentives, is that?
So nothing's changing about them.
Okay, so it's going to be whatever is in T-bill.
So it's going to be whatever is in existing session law. So for the
Okay.
incentives for new PEVs, it's that grid that we put up sometimes where it's based on adjusted gross income and the two different
No,
tiers.
but I mean
and
up
stuff.
to, like, what if we have thousands of them and we don't have enough money to?
So there is an appropriation. It
Yeah,
was
that's
made.
fine.
Yeah, so no additional money is being appropriated. No additional money is being proposed for appropriation in the T-bill or in H101, except in the case of H101 with the $500,000 for e-bikes. And part of that is because if you think back to a year ago, when you did appropriate all the general fund one-time monies for these programs, the expectation was that there would be sufficient funding available to cover multiple fiscal years. And I think the agency has testified that in all of those programs, except for e-bikes, which is now fully depleted, they think they can make it through at least the next fiscal year. So
Okay.
nothing is proposed in H101 to put more money to the programs, just like with the
Any
T-bill.
programs.
Yep, except for
Even though-
e-bikes.
I mean, the sum of 20,000 is appropriated from the transportation for the outreach on efficiency fees and rebates.
Yep, but
That's
so-
already in session law.
No,
Okay.
that would be a new appropriation
That's
for the
right.
upcoming fiscal year.
Okay, so that's what I'm trying to get at, because there are new appropriations
There are
in here.
lots of new appropriations in
Right,
here,
but this particular,
but not for the vehicle
program-
incentive
okay,
programs,
all right,
except for
thank you.
e-bikes.
And it is a little confusing because we
Yeah.
just heard a proposal from the administration that's where we are looking at changing these. So just, right, it is confusing.
Okay,
So,
thank you.
but this, in this bill, there's no changes
Okay,
to the electric, to the amounts within that program.
Yeah, so if we're trying to sort of draw some like broad similarities and differences between the language around vehicle incentive programs that's proposed for the T-bill by the administration and that's in H101, the language that we walked through last week, proposals for the T-bill from the administration, does make changes to incentive amounts and eligibility. H101 doesn't really. It makes the small shift in base MSRP for battery electric vehicles, has the reduction in incentive amount for the dealer piece. H101, just like, so this is going to be a point of strong similarity, just like what the administration is proposing for the T-bill, doesn't appropriate additional money for these programs. And I'm going to say that this bill does propose to appropriate a substantial amount of money, just again, not for those programs because they were
Okay.
fully funded and then some.
Okay, thank you.
I think we had another.
Yes, well, yes. So I just caught up with you about the clause that, and this is a subdivision 4, let's see, D4, 3, D4.
What page you
I'm on
on?
page 25, but I had to print a copy.
I think probably 26 of what everyone else is looking at.
That right there, yes. So it says, it's base MSRP plus the MSRP for any option. So those packages
Yeah.
would be included.
Yeah.
That's, which is different from what I understood before.
Yeah, so if you qualify for, if the vehicle is eligible for an incentive is based on base MSRP. And in existing law, it stops there. There's no other sort of focus paid on what is actually paid for the vehicle. This would be saying that if the vehicle, the actual vehicle, not looking at like, oh, this is a Nissan Leaf, blah, blah, blah. If the actual vehicle that is sold on the lot is sold for more than the base MSRP plus the MSRP for all the add-ons, then the incentive amount is reduced. And I can't speak like fully to the intent here, but a concern that has been expressed with incentive programs, and I would say that this is probably more of an issue in a state unlike Vermont, where incentives are available to everyone without regard to income, that there might be motivation on the part of the dealers to increase the price because supply is low, demand is high, and everyone's getting an incentive.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you've heard testimony as to if that's happening in Vermont.
So the qualification is on the base MSRP.
Yes.
But the incentive reduction, such as it could be, is based on what might be called the sticker price.
Yes.
The bottom line on the sticker on the side of the Lincoln.
Yes.
It says MSRP plus the options and destination charge.
Yep, and the reduction would only happen if what the consumer actually forks
Yes.
over is more than the sticker price on the vehicle.
Right, got it. Thank you.
So Chuck,
Might be confused. Normal state. So the MSRP is the normal sticker price, which includes the base price plus all the additives?
No.
Just the base price?
Yes.
Just the base price.
That's what qualifies a vehicle for an
So
incentive.
$50,000 Tesla may be a $60,000 Tesla.
That's a rebate.
But if the suggested MSRP is 50,000, it would qualify.
Under this proposal, it would qualify. And then under this proposal, if it was sold, if the sticker price of the vehicle that was sold was $54,000, but it was actually sold for $55,000, then the incentive amount would be reduced by $1,000. So vehicle qualifies because it's $50,000 or less base MSRP, and then the analysis of whether or not the incentive amount is reduced.
Base price, the sticker price, and then the add-on price.
Yeah. So you qualify by base, and then the calculation of a reduction incentive is based on whether or not the sticker price and the sales price are not the same.
So you could potentially have a $50,000 car that you had no rebate on.
Yes, you could. So I can't remember what the highest incentive amount for the battery electric vehicles is, but let's pretend for a second that it's $2,500. That $50,000 Tesla ends up having a sticker price of $52,500, but you end up spending $55,000 for it because that's just what happens. You don't get an incentive at all because the $2,500 incentive is fully eaten up by the fact that you paid more than the incentive amount extra above the sticker price.
Less confused.
be more confused, but.
I think that the takeaway here is it's proposing that there is a possible reduction in incentive amount if vehicles are selling for more than the sticker price.
To de-incentivize
The dealers.
the dealers from doing, from marking up, right? But haven't we heard that that's not happening because a dealer doesn't know if somebody has an incentive when they walk in the door because it's based on income?
I feel like I've heard Patrick provide that testimony, but I don't want to definitively say
I
that he
mean,
has.
I think we've heard that several times in this committee. So I'm just,
A distinction of our state where.
yeah, where it's different from other states.
Yeah, I mean, because if you think about other states, if there's no income eligibility requirement associated with the incentive program, everyone who's walking in might be, you expect to be getting the incentive. So they already have an extra $2,500 or whatever in their pocket.
Sure, please, sorry, I'm
Just
right.
along with that, so, and that works for our state because we're doing it as a refund of the.
Because there's income eligibility associated with it. So if you walk
And
into,
you have to prove your income eligibility somehow, or is that an honor code in that case?
Yeah, you do, right?
you self-certify and then there's like you consent to an audit process happening. But a dealership doesn't necessarily know that you are going to be getting an incentive on a vehicle under Vermont's inception of an incentive program.
The auditors will,
What?
but the auditors will.
Yes.
That makes sense?
Yeah.
Okay, you got the answer, yeah. Great. Thank you.
Okay, and our last section on incentive programs is section 17. And this is going to start on page 28. And it's not making any changes to the existing once a year reporting requirement, which this language does have the old name for the House Committee on Energy and Technology, but for what's proposed to be codified in the T-bill, that was corrected. So it's preserving on lines 13 to 18 what you get every year in terms of your annual report on gauging the effectiveness of the vehicle incentive programs. And then it's adding, and this is in subdivision B, biannual, so twice a year reports, January 31st and July 31st, that provides additional information about the incentive programs throughout the year. I think it helps to read little Romanet I and double I together, and this is on page 29, because it seems if you read one and then you read the next one, you're like, oh, well, I'm asking for the same information twice. But what these two subdivisions together will yield is in the July 31st report, you'll know how much money was available for each incentive program on January 1 and on June 30th. So you'll know how much went out the door in incentives over that 6-month period. And then in the January 31st report, you'll get how much was in the program available for the programs on July 1st and December 31st. So for that other 6-month range. I think one of the things that used to be available on the Drive Electric Vermont website, and I haven't seen in several months, was a little widget that said how much money was left in some of the incentive programs. I know that at a time, probably with the first appropriation for the incentive program for new PEVs back in 2019, that money depleted pretty quickly. And then there was a disclaimer that said once it got below a certain point, you needed to kind of pre-request that you were going to try and seek an incentive because they couldn't be providing them at the dealership point then because they might use up all the money without realizing it. And it could be that the widget doesn't have that same necessity now, but this would be getting at the need or the desire for the General Assembly to have more of an update than once a year on the state of the programs, but getting that interim after 6 months report. The other things that would be given in the 6 months reports would be how much money had been appropriated for each program, and then how many incentives were given out in each of the programs for the different ranges there. And then the last two pieces would be any current and ongoing effects to market each program, providing that in the 6-month reports, and any other pertinent data points that the agency thought should be included in those 6-month reports. And while nothing about the annual report requirement is changing, it could be that one of those 6-month reports is kind of absorbed into the annual report. And if this language was enacted and then implemented, it wouldn't be yielding 3 reports. It would be yielding 1 report and then a mini report at the 6-month intervals between the larger reports. And then there are just some technical corrections in subdivision C, especially since the numbering is shifting, but just saying that notwithstanding the part of statute that says reporting requirements go away, this report would continue in perpetuity, provided that an incentive had gone out in one of the programs.
Questions? In this section?
Okay, sections 18 and 19 will look very familiar to people who were on the committee last year. To refresh your memory, these two sections were language that Representative Stebbins worked on, and then this committee included in, and the full House went with that amendment to the miscellaneous motor vehicles bill. And then that's the bill that did not get enacted last year. And this was one of the, or these two sections were either struck from the Senate's response to your proposal of amendment or were modified substantially in the Senate's proposal of amendment on the miscellaneous motor vehicle bill. Both of them would be effective on July 1 of 2023. They both relate to the transportation planning and policy and mission statement of the Agency of Transportation. So something that's very much related to the White Book. And I would say it's a mix of very substantive changes and minor technical corrections. So in section 18, this would be an amendment to 19 VSA section 10B. Subsection A addresses what needs to be included as part of the agency in developing its mission statement. And then in subdivision 2, the mission statement needs to address that transportation projects are, and this is existing law, need to be consistent with the recommendations of the Comprehensive Energy Plan, also sometimes abbreviated the CEP. And then adding to that, that the mission statement needs to be consistent with the recommendations in the Vermont Climate Action Plan, the CAP, that's issued under 10 VSA Section 592, and any rules that have been adopted in accordance with 10 VSA Section 593. Thus far, the only rules that have been adopted in accordance with that is the suite of the Clean Car rules to track what was happening in California. The other changes to what needs to be addressed in the mission statement are in subdivisions 3 and 4, and it would address, the agency would then need to address in its mission statement that the agency itself needs to lead, assist, and partner in the transformation of the transportation sector in order to do two things: to meet the emission reduction requirements of the Global Warming Solution Act, and to ensure that there is an environmentally clean, efficient, multimodal system that will have economic, environmental, equity, and public health benefits for all of Vermonters. And then the final piece that would need to be incorporated into the mission statement is that the agency would need to address the importance of transportation infrastructure resilience and strategies to either construct or retrofit, or both, transportation infrastructure in order to prepare for and adapt for any changes that are related to the climate, to changes in the climate, and add redundancy and efficiency to the transportation network itself, and how they're going to use maintenance and operational strategies to address any potential disruptions in transportation. So those are all things that would need to be reflected in the agency's mission statement that's required under statute.
Representative McCoy had a question.
So all the non-underlined sections are current law.
Correct.
The ones that are underlined were Representative Stebbins' language that we passed last year to put in the DMV. Okay, thank you.
Subsection B, we're still in that same 19 VSA section 10B section. On lines 17 into 18, the Vermont, and this is who the agency needs to coordinate any planning and education efforts with. The Vermont Climate Change Oversight Committee no longer exists. It's not necessarily been replaced by the Vermont Climate Council, but the Vermont Climate Council does now exist. It was established as part of the Global Warming Solutions Act. In the language, and I'm not going to be able to remember all of the proposed changes that the Senate made to your language, but I do remember this one, it just struck out coordinate planning efforts with, and instead of it changing this to Vermont Climate Council, it just said that the agency needs to coordinate planning and education efforts with local and regional planning entities. That's the one I remember. I can't remember the other changes. But again, Representative McCoy, I'm going to answer your question even though you haven't asked it. What you see on the page here is what Representative Stebbins proposed as amendments, what the House put forth as its proposed amendment to the miscellaneous motor vehicle bill.
Both 18 and sections 18 and 19.
18 and 19.
Okay.
There's one change in section 19 that I'll mention when we get to.
Okay.
The shifting of the twos is just a technical correction. Same with what you see on lines 7 and 8, striking out the as amended by. And then the last thing that you will see in section 18, this is going to be on page 32, is in addition to the agency as part of its developing its annual transportation program, the agency needs to give consideration to local, regional, and state agency plans in order to develop or incorporate designs that provide integrated, safe, and efficient transportation and that are consistent with the recommendations of the CEP. That's existing law. The change here would be to say that it also would need to be consistent with any recommendations in the Climate Action Plan.
And may I ask, was this change or recommendation also part of, so it's sections 18 and 19? Okay.
So all of 18 and all of 19 were included by the House in its version of the miscellaneous motor vehicle bill last year. The one difference between the language that you see now and what was included in the House's version of the miscellaneous motor vehicle bill last year is that on page 34, line 14, it now says that there needs to be, and we'll get to, I'm going to go back, but since you asked, for the emissions modeling, it needed to include a qualitative estimation. That's the language that was included last year, proposed to be included last year. This is now a quantitative. And I looked it up to make sure I was getting it right and I didn't have them reversed, but quantitative is going to be number-based. Qualitative is going to be interpretation-based. So now actually looking for a numeric estimation, that is the one change in both sections 18 and sections 19 from what this committee, obviously with different membership, proposed, and the House, obviously with different membership, agreed to make as its proposal to the Senate on the miscellaneous motor vehicle bill last year. Okay, so for purposes of the balance of section 19, what hasn't been proposed to be changed, again, what is not underlined is existing law, what is underlined is a proposal here. The first ones are just some technical corrections from the editors. Just like the existing language says that the long-range systems plan that needs to be developed by the agency needs to be consistent with the CEP, adding, just like it was done in other places, that it also needs to be consistent with the Climate Action Plan. Subsection C is going to give you all of the objectives of the transportation program, and it's making changes to and then adding additional objectives for the transportation program. So one of the existing objectives is that the transportation program needs to accomplish managing, maintaining, and improving the state's existing transportation infrastructure to provide capacity, safety, flexibility in the most cost-effective and efficient manner. This would also be requiring that it needs to provide resiliency. So the transportation program would need to address resiliency. Existing objective that needs to be addressed through the transportation program is achieving recommendations of the CEP. This would also be requiring that it achieve recommendations of the CAP. Subdivision 5, a completely new objective, and that's the objective of transforming the transportation sector to meet the state's emission reduction requirements. And those are going to be under the Global Warming Solutions Act, and ensure that there is an environmentally clean, efficient multimodal system. that will have economic, environmental, equity, and public health benefits for all Vermonters. The biggest part, I think, of section 19, as in addition to the transportation program and the state's emissions modeling efforts across multiple sectors, so not just focused on the transportation sector, is the addition of subsection F. This is on page 34. This language would require the Agency of Natural Resources, so not a requirement on the Agency of Transportation, but on ANR. The Agency of Natural Resources would need to coordinate with the Agency of Transportation in order to incorporate into the modeling that's already required in the tracking and measuring progress tool, that it will look at the relevant elements that are proposed in the transportation program. So the modeling that ANR is required to do would need to reflect elements from the transportation program. And then for purposes of what's included in the transportation program, you know how you get all those 10G reports at the back? You would also need to include, as part of that required reporting, the portion of the tracking and measuring progress tool that ANR is responsible for that's related to the transportation program. And then a quantitative estimation of how effective the pieces of the proposed transportation program will be, an estimate of how effective they will be in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and then a quantitative estimation based on the projections that are published in the greenhouse gas inventory, how much more needs to happen in reductions from the transportation sector in order for the state to reach its emissions reduction requirements. And then also, as part of the 10G reports, in addition to the modeling components, a strategy and plan for how to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions just from the transportation sector in order to achieve the recommendations in the CEP and the CAP in outgoing fiscal years. And then the expectation is that that strategy and plan would need to be used by the Agency of Transportation in ongoing planning efforts.
Representative Campbell?
Just to be sure, so B here is where you were talking about the quantitative versus
Yes.
qualitative.
Yep, and you'll see quantitative twice, those were qualitative. Okay, I feel like that was a very big, dense topic, but it's a lot of changing what's modeled, changing the mission statement, changing what goes into the white book, changing the reports that you get. And I think the Agency of Transportation can tell you a lot more about it than I can, which is really just what the words on the page are.
Campbell?
And again, all of this was passed last year in the miscellaneous motor vehicle bill.
No.
No,
No, it was,
Well, I mean, it passed out of this committee.
it made it out of this committee, it made it out of the House.
just for clarification, it was not passed in the first, it was in the amended version, right? It's the House's amendment to the Senate's proposal, and this went over to the Senate and then did not finally pass.
Started in the Senate.
Yeah.
So
That's where it always starts.
Yeah, so the miscellaneous motor vehicle bill left the Senate, made it to the House. The House made one change to what made it out of the Senate and added language on. And then the Senate basically sent it back with all the added on language, re-deleted. There just wasn't agreement on the additions that were proposed by the House.
Which were these additional sections?
There was other language that the House proposed to be added to the miscellaneous motor vehicle bill, but these were two of those sections.
And there was no conference committee on this, or it was just?
No, it didn't, no. We can talk,
Time ran out.
They just put it on the wall. Okay.
We did that.
Mhm.
I think we put it on the wall.
Yeah, I think we put it
I
on
think
the
it was
wall.
them. was-
Yeah.
But anyways.
Yeah.
Just minor point.
Just to understand the
yeah, there's some history. There's
Good
some
thought.
history, yeah.
There's definitely some history.
I would say, yeah, Scott,
Not the first time that happened.
that's what could happen.
Okay, so scroll down too far. Section 20 is the start of a few sections that are all applicable to complete streets. And complete streets is, like the very short version is just safety and accommodation of all transportation users regardless of age, ability, things like that. So how do we make the streets accessible to everyone? You will see, and I won't bore you with why, from a drafting perspective, that Section 20 proposes amendments to 19 VSA Section 10B. That's the same section that Section 18 was proposing amendments to, so some of them are repeated. So you will see that, like, for example, at the bottom of page 35 and to the top of page 36, the recommendations of the Vermont Climate Action Plan, that language is here. That's not related to complete streets, but you don't want to inadvertently, if you were to enact this entire bill, you wouldn't want Section 20 to inadvertently, like, change back the changes you had made in Section 18. So they're duplicated in both places. If you choose to incorporate some but not all of these sections into the T-bill, we'll just need to make sure that the drafting lines up between the different sections. And this is just a coincidence of the fact that the complete streets language is in 19 VSA Section 10B along with the mission statement language. But one of the things this language proposes to do is to not have that be the case. So from the language in Section 20 that I have not seen in Section 18, the first change you're going to see is on page 35, starting at line 13, taking out the quotation marks for complete streets and then not saying what complete streets principles are in this section, but instead referring to a section that would be added in the 2 sections later that we're going to talk about. But the balance of this section, much like what's happening here, where you're taking out some of the details of complete streets, is removing from 19 VSA Section 10B the complete streets language and instead putting it in its own chapter in Title 19 devoted to complete streets. So the change you see on lines 13 to 16 is to take out the full reference there, but it's referring to saying that the transportation policy needs to consider complete streets as it's going to be defined later. And then the bulk of what is being proposed for removal from Section 19B is going to start at the very top of page 37. It's saying that the agency needs to consider complete streets principles in all state and municipally managed transportation projects and project phases, including planning, development, construction, and maintenance, except in the case of projects or project components involving unpaved highways. Everything that you see starting at line 6 to the end of this section that's being struck out, it's all being added back in an amended way in Section 22. So I'm going to skip through it here because we're going to talk about it in the next place, and I will mention what is amended and what is just moving language that had previously been in one place. So it's basically repealing language from 19 VSA Section 10B. Section 21 is outright repealing all of 19 VSA Section 309D for purposes of the structure of the complete streets language in law now. The consideration of complete streets principles for state projects is in 19 VSA Section 10B, and the consideration for municipally managed projects is in 19 VSA Section 309D. Section 22 is proposing to have all of that language be in its own chapter on complete streets to make it easier to find and put everything state or municipally managed all in one place.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
can I ask a question?
Quite sorry, yeah.
So is Complete Streets a state program or do we get federal funding for Complete Streets?
I'm gonna have to, are you listening?
So I just,
Do we
my
get any
question
federal
is,
funding
I
for
just don't, if
Complete
it's
Streets
federal, if there
projects?
are some federal, I don't wanna screw up federal funding if we're putting in language that goes against what federal funding we may get.
Right.
Okay.
I can't speak to the entirety of the suggested changes in terms of whether there's anything that is inconsistent with federal requirements. But what I can tell you is Complete Streets is a design principle in terms of considerations you make when planning for and constructing a project. So, what are the elements of a crosswalk that would make it safe for both cyclists and pedestrians to navigate that area? And, in the context of the fact that it has cars as well. So it's considering all users in a particular area of the transportation system and planning and designing for and implementing them consistently. So we can use federal funds to develop projects that incorporate complete street principles.
Okay, but yes, with the complete streets principles that we are using, I'm assuming they follow the federal guidelines on what complete streets are that we can actually use federal funding for.
So you've reached the part in the green book that exceeds my level of expertise.
Okay,
But we certainly.
but you understand what
Yeah, I do
I'm getting
understand
at.
what you're
Okay.
saying. And Kevin Marshy of our office is actually on the AASHTO committee, which writes standards and guidelines and principles related to these types of things at the national level, which become adopted for use at DOTs, our standards that we have to go by. And so he'll be able to, when we come in to testify on this, let the committee know if there is anything contemplated in this that would be inconsistent with federal regulations that would then preclude us getting money to implement these activities.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Is it just a follow, is it fair, I mean, Complete Streets isn't a new principle. Like we've been doing work, and so we have projects that take these principles into them and are funded with that federal funds. So I that's good clarification just to make sure that,
Okay.
thank you.
Okay, so in your new chapter in Title 19 on complete streets, you have a definition of complete streets. This is kind of an amalgam of other language that you have seen struck in different places. Oh, and all of this would be effective on July 1 of 2023 and apply to projects that are through a certain phase after January 1 of 2024. So you're not changing the rules of the game in the middle of projects that are already being developed to a certain extent. So this language in the definition is a combination of existing language that was struck or not struck in 19 VSA section 10BA1 and C2A. And for purposes of this chapter, complete streets would mean streets that provide safe and accessible options for multiple travel modes for individuals of all ages and abilities, including walking, cycling, public transportation, and motor vehicles. What you see proposed to be added as section 2402 on the state policy surrounding complete streets is drawn from existing law with some modifications for purposes of this first portion, except in cases of projects or project components involving unpaved highways. That is preserving something in existing law that also is not struck out in the earlier language. So complete streets is not going to apply to unpaved highways. The next piece for all transportation projects and project phases, that is existing language. Complete streets in law right now applies to projects and project phases. An expansion of the language we saw earlier, it was just the projects that are managed by the agency because the municipally managed projects were somewhere else. This is combining them and providing clarification there. And then for purposes of how I said that it covers multiple phases, I would say because of the use of including, which is always just meant to be sort of clarification of this thing includes these other things, but we don't have to list all of them out. That's why you don't see but not limited to in statute. For the assorted components of that project, it's going to be planning, development, construction, or maintenance. One of the things that I have seen be mentioned in Complete Streets is a focus on when a project is going through the construction process, focusing on complete streets there, not just the end result of the project, because people still need to use a project as it's being constructed in some instances. And then it's the policy of the state for the agency and municipalities as applicable to incorporate complete streets principles that this first part is existing, I would say is consistent with existing law, are both permanent and temporary as necessary for each project phase. The next four, so subdivisions 2, 3, 4, and 5, I would say it's either new as like an explicit concept or requirement, or it's providing additional clarification to something that was probably already being considered as part of complete streets, but that would be something for the agency to speak to. But this is requiring incorporation that prioritizes underserved communities that have been historically harmed and segmented by the transportation network, serves individuals of all ages and abilities, including vulnerable users, picking up on the definition of vulnerable users in Title 23, follow best state of the practice design guidance, and are sensitive to the surrounding community, including current and planned buildings, parks and trails, and current and expected transportation needs. The language that you see proposed to be added as section 2403, it's going to be split. Subsection A is going to be on state projects and subsection B is going to be on municipally managed projects. This is all existing law with some small tweaks. So right now, a state managed project needs to incorporate complete streets principles unless the project manager makes a written determination that one of three circumstances or combinations of those circumstances exist. The first one is that use of the transportation facility by pedestrians, bicyclists, or other users is prohibited by law. That's existing statute. That the cost of incorporating complete streets principles is grossly disproportionate. Under existing law, it's just disproportionate to the need, and neither grossly disproportionate nor disproportionate is defined. So that would be something that the project manager would need to make a determination on. To the need or probable use as determined by factors, and it lists some of them out. That is existing law. It's not a change. And then the last instance where you might not need to follow complete streets principles is if incorporating complete streets principles is outside the limited scope of a maintenance project that does not involve the reconstruction of any infrastructure. The existing language is different from that. The existing language is that the project would be incorporating complete streets principles is outside the scope of a project because of its very nature. I think that what is on lines 11 to 13 is consistent with how the agency is interpreting existing law, but that would be a question for the agency. But what this language is doing is saying you need to incorporate complete streets principles unless the project is a maintenance project, it's limited, and it just doesn't involve new infrastructure, reconstructed or anything like that. So you're not making changes to the street. It would be outside the scope of the project to like change signage, for example, to pick a very unrelated to infrastructure example, to then say we're gonna make an accommodation for the use of everyone to be able to use the street. So that's what's attempting to be gotten at subdivision 3, but that would be something to ask the agency about because it is a change from existing law. Subsection B for municipal projects tracks everything that you just saw. It's consistent with existing federal law, except in the instances that I noted, and it would be consistent with subsection A as this language proposes to add, except instead of it being an agency managed project, it's a municipality managed project, and the municipality needs to make the written determination as opposed to the project manager. Subsection C is existing law that's repealed in the prior two sections. The written determination required by the municipality or the project manager is final and shall not be subject to appeal or further review. That's existing law. The posting of the determinations in subsection D, this is a new concept that they need to have the determinations be posted, but it is not a new concept that the determinations need to be preserved and made available. Under session law, and Representative Burke, excellent memory, you did work on the Complete Streets bill in 2011. Under 2011 Acts and Resolves number 34, which was the law that added all of the complete streets language. It did have in session law the requirement that these determinations be made available on request. This would, instead of having them be made available on request, they need to actually be posted to the municipality's website or to the Agency of Transportation's website. So always to the Agency of Transportation's website, and if it's a municipally managed project, also to the municipality's website, those determinations about why complete streets principles weren't followed. Section 2404 would cover your annual report and the creation of a public database. This is all new. It's not required under the current complete streets laws. It has that notwithstanding language that says that the report continues in perpetuity. The agency needs to honor before September 1, starting in 2025, submit a report detailing the state's efforts to follow complete streets policy established in section 2402 during the prior year. And then it needs to create a public database that would have all of the managed projects, determinations of the description of the project, the location of the project, and if the project incorporated complete streets principles, and an explanation of if there were any circumstances that yielded not following complete streets principles. And that would need to have all of the projects for which preliminary engineering is completed after July 1 of 2011. That's when that session law that I mentioned earlier that requires the preservation of this information became effective. So I don't think you were asking the agency to go back and recreate something, but just put into a public database information that they have. The database, but the agency should clarify that for you. And the database needs to be updated on at least an annual basis. And then section 23 gives the agency time to create and post the database, and it needs to be done on or before January 1 of 2024. So that's when the database would need to go live.
Oh, Molly, go ahead.
I just want to give a little context to the complete streets concept. This is something that has been mostly promoted by, not mostly, I mean, a lot of other people too, but they, out of concern for many years about how our people as they age going to be getting around. People who don't necessarily, at a certain point, might not want to drive or whatever. How do we design streets so that there are sidewalks, so that there are, accommodation for persons with disabilities, where there might be public transit stops and things like that. So it's just been one of their missions, the sort of transportation of owners. Just want to note that.
And AARP Vermont did commission a report from Smart Growth America that was made available in November of last year. And it made a number of recommendations. This language addresses some, but not all of those recommendations. Okay, section 24, I know you've heard discussion about the update of the Vermont state standards. Language in the T-bill last year required the agency to come in and report on a plan to update the Vermont state standards. This requires that they be updated along with any standards, guidance, and procedures not later than July 1 of 2024. The last piece on design and complete streets is an appropriation for fiscal year 2024, $50,000, and it's to be done in consultation with the Vermont Climate Council and the Vermont League of Cities and Towns and Regional Planning Commissions to provide training on complete streets to municipalities. There are some states, Massachusetts is an example of one that I think has a program that is sort of held out as being focused on driving municipalities to incorporate complete streets. It provides additional funding to municipalities if they have a complete streets plan and things like that. This doesn't sort of even begin to go as far as what Massachusetts has done. And Representative McCoy, to your question about a federal level, there has been federal legislation proposed, I believe, by either a senator or representative from Massachusetts to have that program sort of be expanded through federal law, and that is not moved. But Massachusetts as a how do we motivate municipalities to address complete streets designs is sort of held out as the gold standard of, if you were trying to get municipalities to address complete streets, this is a way to do it.
Can I ask a question? I mean, was this language modeled on Massachusetts? It sounds like it's not, right?
This language, I would say, well, is the person who wrote the language, and with the direction that I was given by Representative Burke from AARP Vermont, was to not incorporate all of the recommendations from the Smart Growth America report and to really preserve a lot of what is existing law and to codify, as you said, like, they were required to keep these determinations, but it didn't say that they needed to post them. They didn't need to put it in this database to make information more available. So aside from the additions to the policy surrounding complete streets, the determination language isn't really changing. The what needs to be included in a determination by a project manager isn't really changing. It's really just the presentation of that information and having a more expansive policy around complete streets. But I think that Representative Burke or the agency or AARP Vermont could speak to that a lot.
Thank you.
I'd say it also, this looks like more change than it is, because when you're deleting things and adding them other places and making a new chapter, it's hard to see what's moved. And it could be that if you want to move some of this language forward, I could try and work on a side-by-side that would provide a little bit more clarity as to this moves there, but doesn't really change components.
I think that could be helpful if we decide to do that. Yeah.
We only have 2 sections left. I think you're going to finish by
You are doing amazing. You're doing amazing.
So this is all of the Amtrak language. Whenever we are talking about rail, I'm always going to say you need to be wary of federal preemption and the fact that states cannot really regulate rail operations. They can regulate things related to health and safety, but a lot of what is included in Section 26, if it was a mandate saying the agency is required to do this, this is prohibited, Amtrak, you must do this, I think we would have to have a greater conversation about preemption, but most of this language is directing the agency to work with other entities to achieve goals that I think the agency is, in part, already working on, maybe not at the pace that some people would like to see. So subsection A, and this is effective on July 1, 2023, because there is a small appropriation here. Subsection A looks at extending Amtrak service to White River Junction. It would require the agency to work with Amtrak and the Massachusetts Department of Transportation to extend Amtrak service on the Valley Flyer route to White River Junction, Vermont. The agency would need to ensure that there is Amtrak service to and from White River Junction. At least the last trip on the Valley Flyer would need to overnight in White River Junction and would need to originate in White River Junction the next morning. For this purpose, and this is the only one that has an appropriation, $2 million would be appropriated from the Transportation Fund. Doesn't say how it would need to be used, but appropriates $2 million. Subsection B addresses the extension of Amtrak service to Montreal, Quebec. In this instance, the agency would need to continue to work with Amtrak, the Canada Border Security Agency, and U.S. Customs and Border Protection, along with the Federal Railroad Administration and the Ministry of Transportation of Quebec. A lot of entities involved here to extend Amtrak service on the Vermonter to Montreal.
What are we missing here? What are we missing here, Molly? Love for Bennington? White River Junction get ahead of Bennington. I just vote no on principle now.
That's right. I'm in the one with Bennington service too.
Anyways, I couldn't let that.
The last page too.
And just when you think you know somebody.
Oh, feelings are hurt.
Are you on?
Yeah.
It's open. All right, we'll skip the White River Junction. Go right from Greenfield, Massachusetts, over the Route 9 over to Bennington.
There we go.
Perfect.
Or through Guilford.
We're
kidding.
at 5 minutes.
It's a Christmas tree.
Yeah, we're really close, really close.
Under St. John's would be.
So subsection C is both track improvement and extension of service, and that's going to be between Burlington and Essex Junction. The agency needs to continue working with Amtrak and New England Central Railroad to improve that stretch of track in order to bring track to passenger rail standards. And then at a minimum, we need to extend service on the Ethan Allen to Essex Junction. So that's the one that terminates in Burlington. It would instead terminate in Essex Junction, which is where the Vermonter goes. So the two would link. So section D addresses food service on Amtrak. The Agency of Transportation is directed to take over food service on all Amtrak service that operates in Vermont and would need to ensure that the snack cars have Vermont food products and Vermont beers, provide advertisements for Vermont food products and tourism, and practice disposable waste reduction and recycling strategies. Subsection E addresses the use of a certain type of car on the Ethan Allen train. So the agency would need to work with Amtrak to use an engineless cab car, preferably one that is a combination baggage car, also known as a cabbage car, a cabin baggage car, at the end of the train, as opposed to operating the Ethan Allen with a second locomotive. So having one locomotive on each end. This would have a locomotive on only one end. That's the extent of my train knowledge with respect to this subsection. And then finally, subsection F, in terms of the directive to the Agency of Transportation, the agency needs to continue to work with Amtrak to remedy issues with the call center and the website, which doesn't have reliable information about the extension of the Ethan Allen service to Burlington, and that needs to happen as soon as practicable. And then to keep tabs on all these things that the agency is being directed to do, the agency needs to provide written updates on its progress every 6 months, starting on January 1, 2024, and terminating on July 1 of 2026. And then the last section is identical, give or take, to language that made it into the T-bill last year, which was the $1.2 million for zero fare public transit. The money goes to the agency to, in its sole discretion, distribute to transit agencies, which then can be used in the sole discretion of the transit agencies to be used to operate routes other than the commuter and Link Express on a zero fare basis. We talked about all the effective dates as we went through, a lot of on passage. All the fiscal stuff would be effective on July 1, 2023, and then the few outliers like with the fee bates and stuff like that. That's all 46 pages of your bill.
Thank you. Yeah, that is impressive that you were able to cover all of this, and thank you.
You held back your questions, I could feel it.
I have a
Do
question.
you hear the voice of Florida Representative McCormick?
I do,
So, no,
yes, I do.
bet.
Yes.
Anthea, do you know if Chris has done any work on a fiscal note for any of this at all?
I talked to Chris when I was preparing the legislative findings to make sure the numbers were right, and I know that he's looked at H101, but I do not think he's prepared any sort of analysis related to it. Yeah. And I will say, it wouldn't be that difficult to like tally up the appropriations here. I think
Not all the appropriations tallied up, but I don't know hidden costs.
I was going to say that I think a lot of information on hidden costs is probably something that the Agency of Transportation could be better suited to provide you with than Chris, just because they'll have an idea of like how much it actually is going to cost to update the Vermont state standards by July 1 of 2024. I don't know if that's something that Chris necessarily has knowledge of.
Thank you. And I think it's important to pause there since we have to get to the floor. So thank you, everyone, and thank you so much, Anthea. So, start live, please.